This video will show you how to replace the inner tie rod end on a Mitsubishi Outlander. This will be located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we have to do is safely raise and support the front end of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After completing that, to remove the wheel, remove all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts. Now we can get the wheel off of here. Now that we have a wheel off, we can move in towards the tie rods. Just keep in mind we will need to have a 4-wheel alignment when we're done. So as we make our way behind this area looking at our tie rod ends, we want to start directly in the middle of the outer and the inner. We have a jam nut. We're using a 22mm to break this jam nut free. To loosen this, we're actually turning it clockwise, bringing it away from our outer tie rod end. Now that I have movement from that, let's move towards the outer nut on the outer tie rod end. We're using a 17mm to remove the mounting nut. Once we have it out of place, we're going to give it a quick inspection, but start it back on a couple threads. I do have some rust. I'm going to tap this into position. Now continuing on, we're going to be separating the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. I have this nut in place because I don't want the tie rod end to fall down and potentially hurt me. I'm going to be using some penetrant. Now if you have a tie rod end removal tool, you can use that. Not everybody has it. If you happen to have a hammer, you can tap on the steering knuckle. Just be careful not to cause any damage to anything. Once that's separated, go ahead and dislodge it from the steering knuckle. Now we're going to start removing the outer tie rod end. As we remove this, turning it counterclockwise, we're counting the amount of turns it takes to remove it. 1, 2, and so on. I had 16, your results may vary. Now we can start removing the jam nut from the inner tie rod end. When you go to turn this, you may find the entire inner tie rod end spins on you. You can hold it in place using some locking pliers. Continue on with a 22mm to remove that jam nut. Remove your locking pliers. Let's follow the inner tie rod end in towards the bellows boot. In this area, you're going to find that you have a squeezable clamp. I'm going to be using some long nose pliers. We'll grab onto that, slide it right off of there. Just a quick inspection. If it looks like it's worn or damaged, you're going to want to replace it. This one's fine. After removing the clamp, we want to break the bellows boot free from the inner tie rod end. For this, I'm just using a small pick and I have a tiny bit of lubricant on it. I'm being aware and careful not to cause any damage. We just want to break this free. Now at this point, let's follow the bellows boot all the way in towards our power steering rack. Now I'm pointing with my pry bar. If you were to look deep inside this area, you can see that we have a single time use clamp. It has a small ear. I'm using my pry bar and a hammer and I'm going to tap on it, breaking it free. We'll dispose of that clamp properly. Now I do have movement from the clamp. Sometimes it'll break free and you can remove it. Other times you have to remove the power steering rack bellows boot first. That's what I'll have to do. So at this point I'm taking hold of the boot, I'm going to give it a twist and slide it out and away from the power steering rack and my inner tie rod end. There it is, friend. A quick inspection of the bellows boot and we'll set it aside. Now I can remove that clamp. Now we can focus on removing our inner tie rod end. To do this, we need to make our way all the way along the base area where the ball joint is. There's different type of inner tie rod end tools you can use. This is the type that I have. I'm going to put this around the base. I'll tighten it. After that, I'm going to be turning this counterclockwise so we can unscrew the inner tie rod end from the power steering rack. Now we can start unscrewing this from the power steering rack. Just turn it counterclockwise. And there it is, friend. Now, prior to installing any brand new part, let's make sure we clean and inspect the mounting area. I'm paying attention to the threaded portion at the end. So use a clean rag and a quick wipe. A close inspection. This looks good. Now we can prepare to install our brand new inner tie rod end. The first thing we have to do is remove the jam nut. We'll set that aside. Now we can start installing the inner tie rod end onto the steering rack. When we do this, we're doing it by hand. We're going to bottom it out. So right there is where it bottomed out by hand, but I need to continue on. I'm going to tighten this up using my inner tie rod end tool. When I do tighten it, I want to make sure it's secure, but I do not want to cause any damage to my power steering rack. All right there is tight. I'm just going to go a tiny bit further here. As I mentioned, I do not want to cause any damage to my power steering rack. Now I can remove my tool. With your inner tie rod end, you found that it came with a grease packet. That grease needs to be used in two different areas on the inner tie rod end. We're starting in the ball and socket area first. Just going to work that around with a gloved finger, of course. This is going to help prevent moisture making its way in this area. It also acts as a lubricant. With that same lubricant, if you were looking at the inner tie rod end, you can see that there's a small groove. That's where the end of the power steering bellows boot would sit. We need to apply lubricant here as well. That's going to help the alignment professional in the end. Let's get ready to install our power steering rack bellows boot. During the removal process, you remember that the larger diameter port on the rack had a single time use clamp. I'm going to be using a wire tie. I already have this formed in a circle. I'm going to go ahead and bring this down. I want to leave it loose so I can slide it over the power steering rack. Nice and loose. Now we can slide the bellows boot over the inner tie rod end towards the power steering rack. Slide it all the way down. Now I need to make my way all the way to the inboard side. We need to make sure the power steering rack bellows boot is over the rack, and we're going to tighten our wire tie, holding it in position. Slide that over. We'll make sure that the wire tie is in the proper groove on that power steering rack bellows boot and make sure it's nice and tight. Of course, trim off any excess. Take hold of the bellows boot, attempt to slide it off of the power steering rack. It should not slide out of place. Now let's focus on the outer portion of the bellows boot. We need to make sure it aligns with the groove that we applied lubricant on. I have a wire tie for this as well. At this point, we're going to install our jam nut. I like to bring it approximately halfway up the threaded area. I'm going to apply some anti-seize. Let's apply some anti-seize on this portion of the threaded area of the inner tie rod end. Now let's get ready to install our tie rod end. Now when we go to install the outer tie rod end, we need to make sure we turn it in the same amount of turns it took to remove it originally. My count was 16. 1, 2, and so on. When we stop, we're stopping with the stud facing up. Let's secure the outer tie rod end to the steering knuckle next. We should be able to pivot things as necessary. Now that I have that pressed up, I'm going to continue on with my mounting nut. Go ahead and tighten that. The torque for it is 18 foot-pounds. Double check to make sure that's secured in place. We'll continue on to our jam nut next. Now as far as the jam nut, we need to make sure we bring this all the way up against the outer tie rod end and make sure it's tight. Now when we tighten the jam nut, I'm going to be using a 21mm wrench to hold my outer tie rod end still. And now my 22 for the jam nut. We're turning it counterclockwise until it's completely bottomed out. Double check to confirm the outer tie rod end is level to the ground. Now one last quick inspection in this area and we can reinstall our front wheel. Once you have the wheel in place, we'll continue on to all 5 of our 21mm headed lug nuts. We're going to start them on. We'll bottom them out in a crisscross manner. We'll get the wheel back on the ground and torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Now I've got my wheel back on the ground. I'm torquing each one of my 21mm lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. I've got my torque wrench. Torqued. Okay friend, we finished our installation. Now the next thing you have to do is take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.